You're looking at a man who no longer belongs in this company. Naomi Sinclair's voice sliced cleanly across the executive boardroom, cold as winter steel beneath the glow of Manhattan's late afternoon skyline. No one moved. No one even reached for their coffee. 40 floors above the city, inside the glass tower of Sinclair Aerodyne, silence pressed against the room like a storm waiting to break. Caleb Mercer stood alone at the far end of the conference table, one hand resting lightly on the leather chair beside him. His employee badge still hung around his neck. His faded charcoal jacket looked out of place among the polished suits and glowing tablets surrounding him. A few executives avoided eye contact. Others stared openly, relieved it wasn't them. Naomi remained standing at the head of the table, stunning in a fitted ivory blazer and black heels that clicked softly against the marble floor each time she shifted her weight. Her hair was tied back flawlessly, every detail of her appearance controlled with surgical precision. The board has made its decision, she continued. Your department failed the inspection review for the third quarter in a row. Effective immediately, your employment with Sinclair Aerodyne is terminated. A quiet exhale moved through the room. Someone near the windows lowered their eyes. Caleb simply nodded once. Not angry, not defeated, just tired in a way most people in that room could never understand. Naomi noticed it immediately, and for reasons she couldn't explain, it irritated her even more. Do you understand what I'm saying, Mr. Mercer? She asked sharply. Caleb finally looked up at her. Calm gray eyes. Steady. Controlled. The kind of eyes that had learned long ago not to react to humiliation. I understand, he said quietly. His voice wasn't defensive. It wasn't pleading. Somehow that made the room even more uncomfortable. Naomi folded her arms. Security will escort you downstairs. One of the younger executives shifted awkwardly in his seat. Another pretended to check emails. Nobody spoke for Caleb. Nobody ever did. He reached up slowly and unclipped his company badge. The tiny plastic card tapped softly against the conference table as he set it down. Such a small sound, yet somehow it echoed. Caleb turned toward the door without another word. The city glowed orange beyond the massive windows behind him, sunlight reflecting against steel skyscrapers and drifting clouds over the Hudson River. For a moment, Naomi watched his reflection disappear across the polished floor. A fired maintenance director. A washed-up single father. A man the world had clearly passed by. Then the building began to tremble. At first it was subtle. A vibration beneath the marble floor. A faint rattling in the water glasses. Several executives looked around in confusion. Then came the sound. Deep. Rhythmic. Heavy rotor blades cutting through the Manhattan sky. Every head turned toward the windows at once. Naomi stepped forward instinctively. 3 matte black military helicopters descended between the surrounding towers like something out of a classified operation. Gasps broke across the room. One executive nearly dropped his phone. The helicopters hovered level with the 40th floor, wind roaring outside the glass, powerful enough to shake the blinds against the windows. On the side of the lead aircraft was a silver insignia almost no civilian ever saw up close. United States Strategic Air Command. The entire room froze. Naomi's expression tightened. What the hell? She whispered. Down below on the street, black SUVs were already pulling up to the tower entrance. Men in dark uniforms exited quickly, moving with disciplined urgency. One of them spoke into a headset while pointing toward the building. Another held a sealed black case against his chest. Inside the boardroom, nobody noticed Caleb had stopped walking. He stood near the doorway with one hand resting quietly against the frame, his back still turned to the room. The rotor noise thundered through the skyline. Then one of the helicopters slowly rotated toward the executive windows. And painted beneath the cockpit, visible for only a moment in the evening sun, were 4 words that drained the color from Naomi Sinclair's face. Authorized for Commander Mercer. Before the story takes a turn, subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss what happens next. And tell me, do you think she should trust him? Let me know in the comments. Now let's continue. The black SUVs remained outside Sinclair Aerodyne long after Caleb Mercer disappeared from the building. Employees crowded behind the lobby glass pretending not to stare while uniformed officers moved with quiet precision beneath the flashing reflection of city lights. Nobody understood what they had just witnessed. Nobody except Naomi Sinclair, and even she could not fully process it. 40 minutes later, Caleb drove north through the fading New York traffic in a 12-year-old Ford pickup that rattled slightly every time he touched the brakes. The heater clicked weakly against the November cold while soft classic rock played low through worn speakers. His hands rested calmly on the wheel, steady despite the chaos he had left behind. Manhattan slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror, swallowed by bridges, gray sky, and riverside fog. He did not call anyone. He did not explain himself. That was the strange thing about men who had carried heavy things for too long. Silence became part of their bones. By the time he reached the small town of Maplewood, the streets were glowing beneath old amber streetlights and Christmas decorations already hanging too early across Main Street. The little houses looked warm from the outside. Front porches, wreathed, wooden fences dusted with cold rain. Caleb pulled into the cracked driveway of a modest blue house near the edge of town, just as the kitchen light flickered on inside. Before the engine fully stopped, the front door opened. "Dad!" Lily Mercer ran down the porch steps wearing fuzzy socks and an oversized sweatshirt nearly swallowing her tiny frame. Her blonde ponytail bounced as she hurried through the cold air toward the truck. Caleb stepped out just in time to catch her hug. She squeezed him tightly around the waist like she had been waiting all evening to make sure he came home in one piece. "You are late," she said softly against his jacket. "I know. Did they make you stay again?" Caleb hesitated only half a second. "Something like that." Lily leaned back just enough to study his face. "Children always notice the things adults tried to hide." "Dad," she asked quietly, "did they hurt your feelings again?" The question landed harder than anything Naomi Sinclair had said in that boardroom. Caleb smiled faintly anyway. "Gentle. Controlled." "No, sweetheart," he answered. "Feelings heal." Lily looked unconvinced, but she nodded slowly and took his hand as they walked toward the house together. Inside, the warmth smelled like tomato soup, cinnamon candles, and laundry detergent. The television played softly in the background while rain tapped against the kitchen windows. Everything about the house felt small but cared for. School drawings covered the refrigerator beside overdue utility bills. A pair of Lily's sneakers sat near the heater vent drying from the rain. Caleb hung his jacket carefully by the door like a man trying not to bring the outside world in with him. "Miss Parker brought over pie again," Lily announced proudly. "She says you work too hard and look too skinny." Caleb gave the smallest laugh. "Miss Parker says that every week. She also said your face looks sad lately." Caleb loosened his boots slowly. "Your teacher notices too much." Lily climbed onto a kitchen stool while he reheated soup on the stove. The overhead light buzzed faintly above them. Quiet filled the room comfortably, the kind built from love instead of loneliness. Then Lily glanced toward the hallway. Those men called again today. Caleb stopped stirring for only a moment. "What men?" "The serious-sounding ones. They asked if you checked your messages." The spoon resumed moving through the soup. Slow circles. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them you were making my science fair volcano, and saving the world would have to wait." Caleb lowered his eyes, hiding a tired smile. "Smart answer." Later that night, after Lily fell asleep on the couch beside her homework, Caleb carried her carefully to bed. Rain drifted softly outside while the old house creaked against the wind. He stood in the hallway afterward for a long moment, watching her sleep peacefully beneath glow-in-the-dark stars stuck across the ceiling. Then quietly, almost reluctantly, he walked into the garage. Dust floated through the dim overhead bulb. Old toolboxes lined the walls beside fishing gear and storage bins. In the far corner sat a locked black military case hidden beneath a faded canvas tarp. Caleb stared at it silently. The world inside Sinclair Aerodyne had finally caught up to him. And somewhere high above the sleeping town, the distant sound of helicopter blades echoed once more through the clouds. Naomi Sinclair had built her entire life on one dangerous belief: control everything before it controls you. At 6:15 the next morning, the executive elevator carried her silently toward the top floor of Sinclair Aerodyne, while Manhattan disappeared beneath heavy rain clouds outside the glass walls. She stood alone inside the elevator, one hand wrapped around a paper cup of untouched black coffee, the other scrolling through dozens of overnight crisis alerts flooding her phone. Her reflection stared back at her in the mirrored steel doors. Perfect makeup. Perfect posture. Perfect composure. But her eyes looked exhausted. The helicopters from the night before had not left the building until nearly midnight. Neither had the federal officials. And nobody would explain why they had arrived for a maintenance director she had fired in front of the board. The elevator opened directly into the executive level, where tension already hung thick in the air. Assistants moved quickly between offices whispering into headsets, while legal teams crowded conference rooms carrying stacks of contracts and classified folders. The massive digital stock board near reception glowed red across the screen. Sinclair Aerodyne shares were slipping by the minute. Naomi walked straight through the chaos without slowing down. "Where is Daniel?" she asked sharply. "War room," an assistant answered nervously. "The Defense Department called again." Of course they did. Naomi pushed through the glass doors of the Executive Conference Center, where half a dozen senior staff members immediately stood when she entered. Nobody smiled. Nobody even pretended things were normal anymore. Daniel Reeves, the company's chief operations officer, looked pale beneath the fluorescent lights. "Tell me this is under control," Naomi said. Daniel hesitated too long. That alone made her stomach tighten. "We lost access at 2:17 this morning," he admitted quietly. Naomi stopped walking. "Lost access to what?" Daniel swallowed hard. "The Sentinel platform." The room went silent. Naomi stared at him as though she had misheard the words entirely. Sentinel was not just another software contract. It was the future of Sinclair Aerodyne, an artificial intelligence-based national air defense network worth nearly $11 billion in federal agreements. The project that had turned Naomi Sinclair into the youngest female aerospace chief executive officer in America. Her entire empire rested on it. "That is impossible," she said coldly. "Restore the authorization tree." "We tried." "Then override it." "We cannot." Naomi's voice sharpened instantly. "Why not?" One of the cybersecurity engineers slowly turned his monitor toward her. Across the black screen, a single line of white text blinked quietly. "Master authorization revoked. Primary access requires commander-level clearance." Naomi frowned. "Who issued this?" Nobody answered. The young engineer finally cleared his throat carefully. "We believe the original architecture was designed with a military failsafe." Naomi looked around the room. "And," Daniel finally said the name nobody wanted to say aloud. "Caleb Mercer." Silence settled like concrete. Naomi laughed once under her breath in disbelief. "The maintenance director?" "Former maintenance director," someone corrected softly. Naomi ignored him. "You are telling me our entire defense platform is locked behind a man fixing air conditioning systems?" Daniel lowered his eyes. Apparently he did a little more than that. Rain hammered against the windows overlooking the city. Naomi walked toward the glass slowly, trying to process the humiliation rising in her chest. The room behind her felt smaller now, less stable. She remembered Caleb standing calmly at the end of that conference table, while she dismissed him like a worn-out employee nobody needed anymore. The memory suddenly felt dangerous. "How much did he build?" she asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. Then the lead engineer spoke in almost a whisper. "All of it." Naomi turned sharply. "What?" "The core flight defense architecture. The emergency satellite synchronization. The encrypted response network." Most of the engineers thought the original creator retired years ago. Another pause. "We did not know Commander Mercer and Caleb Mercer were the same person." Naomi felt something unfamiliar move through her then. Not anger. Not fear. Shame. Real shame. The kind that arrives when arrogance collides headfirst with truth. Before anyone could speak again, the conference room doors burst open. A military liaison officer entered carrying a sealed black folder. Water dripped from his coat onto the marble floor. "Miss Sinclair," he said firmly, "the Pentagon is requesting immediate contact with Commander Mercer." Naomi stared at him. "And if we cannot reach him?" The officer's expression hardened slightly. "Then by noon, every aircraft connected to the Sentinel network across the Eastern Corridor will remain grounded." By 11:30 that morning, Sinclair Aerodyne no longer felt like a technology company. It felt like a building waiting for judgment. Federal vehicles lined the street outside while security teams moved through the lobby with tense expressions and lowered voices. News helicopters circled somewhere above the clouds, their distant rotor noise blending with the constant rain against the tower windows. Inside the executive war room, nobody touched the catered breakfast trays sitting untouched near the wall. Coffee had gone cold hours ago. Every screen in the room displayed the same blinking warning across the Sentinel network. Access denied. Naomi Sinclair stood near the center table with her arms folded tightly, watching engineers fail one after another. Password resets. Emergency protocols. Government bypass requests. Nothing worked. Every road led back to one name. Mercer. Try the Denver relay again, Naomi ordered sharply. We already did, an engineer answered nervously. Then reroute through Virginia. Same result. Naomi exhaled slowly through her nose. She hated repeated failure. Hated helplessness even more. Daniel Reeves stepped closer with a tablet in hand. There is something else. Naomi looked up impatiently. What now? Daniel hesitated before turning the screen toward her. We pulled archived development records from 12 years ago. Naomi scanned the files quickly. Technical schematics. Security approvals. Defense contracts. Then she froze. At the bottom of nearly every classified authorization was the same signature. Commander Caleb Mercer. Her eyes narrowed. How did nobody know this? Daniel gave a hollow laugh under his breath. Because he never told anyone. The room grew quieter as more files appeared across the monitors. Satellite defense integration. Airspace synchronization systems. Emergency civilian override protections. Caleb's fingerprints were everywhere inside the architecture of Sentinel. Entire sections of the network had apparently been designed personally by him years before Sinclair Aerodyne ever acquired the contract. Naomi stared at the screens, trying to reconcile the image in her mind. The quiet man fixing broken ventilation units. The tired single father carrying a metal lunchbox through maintenance halls every morning. The same man who apparently designed the backbone of one of the most advanced defense systems in the country. It made no sense. Unless he wanted it that way. Why would someone like that work maintenance? One board member whispered. Nobody answered immediately. Then an older engineer sitting near the far end of the room slowly removed his glasses. Harold Bennett had worked at Sinclair longer than almost anyone else. White hair. Worn suspenders. The kind of man most executives stopped noticing years ago. Because he was hiding, Harold said quietly. Naomi looked toward him. You knew. Harold nodded once. Not everything. But enough. Naomi walked closer. Start talking. Harold glanced around the room before lowering his voice. About 8 years ago, one of the early Sentinel simulations failed during testing. Total systems collapse. Communications blackout. The Pentagon was furious. He paused. Every engineer panicked except Mercer. Naomi listened carefully now. What did he do? Stayed all night rewriting the entire emergency response tree by himself. Harold smiled faintly at the memory. No yelling. No ego. Just quiet focus. One of the younger executives frowned. Then why was he never promoted? Harold looked genuinely confused by the question. Because he kept refusing it. Silence followed. Harold leaned back slowly. He never cared about titles. Every time leadership tried putting him in public roles, he turned them down. Naomi crossed her arms tighter. People do not walk away from power like that. Harold's tired eyes met hers directly. Good men sometimes do. The words landed harder than Naomi expected. Before she could respond, alarms suddenly flashed across 3 monitors at once. Engineers straightened instantly. We have another lockout, someone shouted. What kind? External intrusion attempt on Sentinel flight routing. The room erupted into frantic movement. Fingers slammed against keyboards. Calls flooded secure lines. Naomi stepped toward the main screen as hundreds of blinking aircraft indicators across the eastern corridor turned yellow one after another. Can we contain it? She demanded. Nobody answered fast enough. Then Daniel's phone rang. He glanced at the number and immediately went pale. It is the Pentagon. Naomi grabbed the phone from his hand. This is Naomi Sinclair. A deep voice answered immediately. Miss Sinclair, this is General Raymond Hale. Naomi recognized the name instantly. 4-star Air Force Command. One of the most powerful military officials in the country. General, she said carefully, we are handling the situation. No, the general replied coldly. You are not. Naomi swallowed. Rain hammered against the windows behind her. Then tell me what you need. The line went silent for half a second. Then came the answer that drained the room of air. I need you to find Commander Mercer before the sky over the East Coast goes dark. The rain finally stopped just after sunset, but the tension inside Sinclair Aerodyne only grew heavier as darkness settled across Manhattan. News anchors now filled every television screen in the executive lobby, speaking in cautious tones about temporary airspace delays and unexplained defense network interruptions along the East Coast. Employees who normally rushed home lingered near elevators, whispering nervously in clusters. Nobody understood how a company worth billions had become dependent on a quiet maintenance director they barely remembered speaking to. Naomi Sinclair stood alone inside her office, staring at the city lights beyond the glass walls. Her untouched dinner sat cold on the desk behind her beside 3 ringing phones she no longer wanted to answer. For the first time in years, control was slipping through her fingers. And somewhere deep beneath her frustration was a quieter feeling she hated even more. Regret. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Miss Sinclair, her assistant asked carefully through the doorway. There is someone here from Strategic Air Command. Naomi closed her eyes briefly before turning around. Send them in. The man who entered did not look impressed by wealth or skyscrapers or billion-dollar companies. Colonel David Ross carried himself with the calm discipline of someone who had spent most of his life around real pressure. Mid-50s. Broad shoulders. Dark blue uniform perfectly pressed. The silver stars near his collar caught the office lights as he stepped inside. Naomi extended a professional hand. Colonel. He shook it once. Firm. Brief. Miss Sinclair. Neither sat down immediately. The city hummed quietly outside the windows while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the river. Naomi finally broke the silence. I assume this is about Commander Mercer. The colonel studied her for a moment before answering. You fired him yesterday? Naomi crossed her arms defensively. I made a corporate decision based on performance reviews. The colonel's expression did not change. Interesting. Naomi felt irritation rise instantly. If you have something to say, Colonel, say it. He stepped toward the windows slowly. Do you know why the Sentinel network has never suffered a catastrophic breach? Naomi said nothing. Because Caleb Mercer built fail-safes nobody else knew existed. The colonel looked back at her. And because for 12 years, he quietly monitored every vulnerability himself without asking for recognition. Naomi swallowed. Why would someone with his background hide inside a maintenance department? Colonel Ross gave a faint smile that carried more sadness than humor. Because after his wife died, he stopped caring about being important. The room fell silent again. Naomi looked away first. The colonel continued softly. Most men who carry that level of responsibility either become addicted to power or destroyed by it. He paused near her desk. Mercer walked away from both. Naomi lowered her voice. Who exactly is he? The colonel looked at her carefully, then opened the black folder he carried under his arm. Inside were photographs Naomi had never seen before. Caleb in military uniform standing beside decorated pilots. Caleb inside command centers filled with glowing satellite maps. Caleb shaking hands with presidents and generals. In every photo his expression remained exactly the same. Calm. Controlled. Quiet. Naomi stared at the images in disbelief. This cannot be real. It is classified, the colonel replied. Or at least it was until your company locked itself out of its own defense system. Naomi slowly sat down behind her desk. Her high heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she lowered herself into the chair, suddenly looking less like a powerful chief executive officer, and more like someone realizing how little she truly understood the people around her. Why did nobody tell me? She whispered. Colonel Ross answered immediately. Because Commander Mercer requested anonymity in exchange for designing Sentinel. Naomi looked up sharply. Why? His daughter. The colonel's voice softened for the first time. He wanted a normal life for her. Naomi stared at the rainwater still sliding slowly down the windows outside. Somewhere across the city, Caleb Mercer was probably helping with homework or making dinner while half the federal government searched for him. The thought unsettled her more than she expected. Suddenly alarms erupted again across the executive floor outside her office. Phones rang instantly. Employees shouted across hallways. Naomi stood sharply. Daniel Reeves rushed through the doorway pale with panic. "We have a problem." "What now?" Naomi demanded. Daniel held up a tablet with trembling hands. Several aircraft just lost synchronized navigation support over the Eastern Corridor. Colonel Ross stepped forward instantly. "How long before failure?" "Less than 3 hours." Silence hit the office hard enough to feel physical. Naomi turned slowly toward the colonel. "Tell me where Mercer is." The colonel met her eyes evenly. "That is the problem, Miss Sinclair." He paused. "Commander Mercer does not want to be found." The old garage behind Caleb Mercer's house smelled like cedarwood, machine oil, and rain-soaked metal. Outside, the wind moved softly through the maple trees while the small town of Maplewood settled into the quiet rhythm of another cold evening. Inside the house, Lily slept beneath a pile of blankets with her science fair project still sitting unfinished beside the couch. But Caleb remained awake. He sat alone at the worn wooden workbench near the back of the garage, one hand resting against the black military case he had not opened in years. The single overhead bulb buzzed faintly above him, throwing pale light across shelves filled with old tools and carefully labeled storage boxes. For a long time, he simply stared at the case without touching it. Some memories stayed quiet until the world forced them awake again. Finally, Caleb unlocked the metal latches. The sound echoed softly through the garage. Inside rested a folded dark blue uniform wrapped carefully beside medals, classified patches, satellite maps, and faded photographs worn at the edges from age and handling. Caleb picked up one photograph slowly. 6 men standing beside a military aircraft beneath desert sunlight somewhere overseas. Younger faces. Stronger smiles. The kind men where before life teaches them how quickly everything can disappear. Caleb's thumb brushed across the picture before setting it back down again. He reached next for a silver-framed photograph tucked beneath the uniform. His wife, Emily Mercer, stood laughing in the picture with wind caught in her hair while little Lily sat on her shoulders, barely 3 years old at the time. Caleb looked at the image quietly, the same way people look at stars. After losing their way in darkness. "You always said hiding would not last forever," he murmured softly. The garage remained silent except for rainwater dripping outside the gutters. Then his phone vibrated across the workbench. Unknown federal number. Caleb ignored it. Seconds later another call came. Then another. He silenced the phone completely and leaned back slowly in the chair. Somewhere far away, powerful people were panicking. But here, inside this garage, none of that mattered more than the sleeping little girl inside the house. That was the thing Naomi Sinclair and the others did not understand yet. Caleb had not walked away from power because he was weak. He walked away because he finally understood what mattered more than being needed by the world. A sudden creak behind him interrupted the silence. "Dad!" Caleb turned immediately. Lily stood near the garage doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes while holding her favorite blanket against her shoulders. "You should be asleep," Caleb said gently. Lily looked toward the open military case. "Are those your medals?" Caleb hesitated. "Some of them." She stepped closer carefully, curiosity replacing sleepiness. "Were you really a soldier?" Caleb smiled faintly. "Something like that." Lily's eyes moved across the photographs and ribbons with growing wonder. "Then why do you fix air conditioners?" The question almost made him laugh. Instead he looked down quietly at the picture of Emily again. "Because after your mom died," he said softly, "I promised myself I would never miss another bedtime." Lily's expression changed immediately. Children understood love faster than adults ever did. She walked closer and climbed carefully into his lap despite being almost too old for it now. Caleb wrapped one arm around her automatically while cold wind rattled softly against the garage door. "The people on the phone sound important," she whispered. "They are. Are you going to leave again?" Caleb looked toward the darkness outside the garage window. Somewhere high above the clouds, distant helicopter blades hummed faintly across the night sky. He could feel the world pulling at him again like an old wound reopening beneath the surface. "I do not know," he admitted honestly. Lily rested her head against his chest. "I do not like when people need you more than I do." Caleb closed his eyes briefly at those words. Then suddenly the quiet town outside exploded with flashing lights. White beams swept across the windows. Engines rumbled heavily down the street. Caleb stood instantly with Lily still in his arms and walked toward the front driveway. Outside, 6 black government SUVs rolled slowly to a stop beside the house while neighbors peeked nervously through curtains up and down the block. Men in dark uniforms stepped out one by one beneath the glow of streetlights. At the center of them stood Colonel David Ross. The older officer removed his gloves slowly as he approached the porch. His expression carried urgency now. Real urgency. Caleb opened the front door before the man could knock. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then the colonel finally said quietly, "Commander, we are out of time." The flashing government vehicles outside Caleb Mercer's home painted the quiet neighborhood in waves of red and white light, while curious neighbors watched from behind curtains and half-open doors. Maplewood had never seen anything like this before. Children pressed faces against windows. Porch lights flicked on one by one down the street. Yet in the middle of all the tension, Caleb stood calmly in the doorway holding his daughter against his chest like the outside world could wait another minute. Colonel David Ross removed his cap respectfully before speaking again. "Commander, we have lost 3 additional synchronization sectors since sunset." Caleb's expression barely changed. "How bad?" "Commercial rerouting has already started from Boston to Washington." The colonel lowered his voice further. "If Sentinel collapses completely, every connected aircraft system along the eastern corridor goes blind." Lily tightened her small grip around Caleb's jacket at the word blind. Caleb noticed immediately. "Inside, sweetheart," he said softly. "But Dad." "Inside." She hesitated before nodding slowly and stepping back into the warm light of the house. Caleb waited until the door closed behind her before turning fully toward the colonel. Cold wind swept across the driveway carrying the smell of wet pavement and distant chimney smoke. "You should not have come here," Caleb said quietly. Colonel Ross gave a tired smile. "You know I would not unless there was no other choice." Caleb glanced briefly at the line of black SUVs idling beneath the streetlights. The Pentagon sent half a convoy into a residential neighborhood. That means somebody is panicking. Everybody is panicking. The 2 men stood silently for a moment like soldiers who no longer needed many words between them. Finally Caleb looked toward the sky. "How long do we really have?" "Less than 2 hours before full system fragmentation." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. Somewhere inside the house, Lily's muffled footsteps moved across the wooden floor. A child making hot chocolate while powerful men waited outside for her father to save the country again. The irony almost hurt. "I retired for a reason, David." The colonel nodded once. "I know." "No," Caleb said softly. "You know the report. That is different." Wind rustled through the trees above them. Then the colonel reached slowly into his coat and handed Caleb a thin photograph. Naomi Sinclair, standing alone inside the Sinclair Aerodyne war room earlier that evening. Exhausted, pale, surrounded by glowing crisis screens. Caleb frowned slightly. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because she has not left the building in 18 hours trying to fix a mistake she barely understands." Caleb said nothing. Colonel Ross studied him carefully. "She did not know who you were." Caleb looked down at the photograph again. Naomi no longer looked cold or untouchable there. Just tired. Human. "Most people do not," Caleb replied quietly. "You let them believe you were small." "No," Caleb corrected softly. "I let them believe titles matter more than character." The colonel almost smiled at that. Suddenly another pair of headlights turned slowly into the driveway. A sleek black sedan stopped near the curb and for a moment nobody moved. Then the rear passenger door opened. Naomi Sinclair stepped out into the cold night air wearing the same ivory blazer from the day before, though now wrinkled from exhaustion and rain. Her hair was loose for the first time Caleb had ever seen it, slightly damp around her shoulders. She looked less like a billionaire executive tonight, and more like someone carrying the weight of a collapsing world. The neighborhood watched openly now from nearby windows as the famous Naomi Sinclair walked alone toward the modest blue house at the edge of town. She stopped several feet in front of Caleb. Neither spoke immediately. The wind moved softly between them. Finally Naomi looked up at him, and for the first time since they met, there was no arrogance left in her voice. "I was wrong." Caleb remained still. Naomi swallowed carefully before continuing. "I thought I understood strength. I thought leadership meant control." Her eyes lowered briefly. "I did not know dignity could look like silence." The street grew completely still around them. Even the officers near the SUVs looked away respectfully. Naomi's voice softened further. "Please," she whispered. "People are depending on you." Caleb looked at her quietly for several seconds. Then from inside the house, Lily's small voice drifted through the open doorway. "Dad." Caleb turned instinctively toward the sound. And in that moment Naomi Sinclair finally understood the one thing more powerful than military rank, billion-dollar companies, or national defense systems. A good man who loved his child more than he loved being important. The flight back to Manhattan took 28 minutes. Nobody spoke much inside the military helicopter as rain clouds drifted beneath the dark blades cutting across the night sky. Naomi Sinclair sat across from Caleb Mercer with both hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup of untouched coffee, while Colonel David Ross monitored updates through a secure headset near the cockpit. The cabin lights glowed dim amber against steel walls and strapped equipment cases, but Caleb barely seemed to notice any of it. He sat quietly near the open side window wearing an old dark jacket over a plain gray shirt, his calm eyes fixed on the scattered lights below. Naomi watched him carefully when he was not looking. She still struggled to connect the man beside her with the story she had heard only hours earlier. The architect of Sentinel, the military strategist, the invisible genius who once stood quietly in maintenance hallways carrying toolboxes, while executives walked past him without a second glance. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. "You could have told people who you were," Naomi finally said softly over the hum of the rotors. Caleb did not look at her. "Would it have changed how they treated me?" Naomi opened her mouth to answer but stopped. The truth sat too heavily between them. Caleb turned slightly toward the dark skyline ahead. "Respect built from fear disappears the moment power leaves the room." His voice remained calm. "Character does not." Naomi lowered her eyes quietly after that. 20 minutes later the helicopter descended onto the rooftop landing platform of Sinclair Aerodyne where armed security teams and federal officials already waited beneath flashing runway lights. The moment Caleb stepped out onto the rooftop, the atmosphere changed completely. Officers who outranked nearly everyone in the building straightened instinctively. Several saluted him without hesitation. Caleb acknowledged them with a simple nod and kept walking. Naomi noticed something then that stayed with her forever. Nobody respected him because they were forced to. They respected him because they trusted him. Inside the executive command floor, chaos had reached a breaking point. Engineers shouted across glowing monitors while emergency alerts flashed red across every screen. Commercial flight grids along the eastern corridor were beginning to fail one after another. Navigation synchronization had collapsed across 3 major sectors. Daniel Reeves rushed forward the second Caleb entered the room. "Commander, we have less than 40 minutes before total relay failure." Caleb moved toward the central system table immediately. Calm, focused, like a man returning to an old language he never truly forgot. "Show me the breach pattern." Engineers quickly pulled up maps and encrypted code streams across the giant displays. Naomi stood nearby watching silently as Caleb scanned the system. Architecture with astonishing speed. He asked short, precise questions. "When did the sequence begin?" 2:17 Eastern Time. "Origin point?" "Unknown." "No," Caleb corrected quietly while studying the data. "Not unknown." His fingers moved across the controls rapidly. Lines of code scrolled across the screens faster than most engineers could follow. The room gradually fell silent around him. "This is not an external attack," Caleb said. "It is a recursive authorization conflict triggered by duplicate military satellite routing." Daniel blinked. "Can you fix it?" Caleb looked up evenly. "I can stop it." Naomi stepped closer instinctively. "How?" Caleb's eyes met hers briefly. by shutting down the core Sentinel bridge manually before the system tears itself apart. Several engineers immediately protested. That would black out every connected sector. Only temporarily, Caleb replied calmly. 8 minutes maximum. And if it fails? One executive asked nervously. Caleb's expression never changed. Then every aircraft connected to Sentinel loses synchronized guidance. Silence crushed the room instantly. Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken beneath the pressure hanging in the air. Hundreds of flights. Thousands of lives. Entire sections of national airspace depending on the next decision. Caleb looked around the room slowly. Nobody here truly understood the weight he carried except perhaps Colonel Ross. Yet Caleb himself looked almost peaceful, like a man who stopped being afraid long ago. Do it, Naomi whispered suddenly. Every head turned toward her. She stepped closer to Caleb, her voice stronger this time despite the fear in her eyes. I trust you. Caleb studied her for one quiet moment. Then without another word, he placed his hand against the central authorization scanner. The monitors across the command floor instantly flashed white. Warning alarms exploded throughout the building. Across the eastern United States, hundreds of aircraft indicators vanished from the network at once. Several engineers gasped in panic. Naomi instinctively grabbed the edge of the command table, as darkness rolled across the entire Sentinel grid. For 6 unbearable seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then one by one, the flight systems began returning online. For a moment after the systems came back online, nobody inside Sinclair Aerodyne made a sound. The massive command floor glowed softly beneath rows of restored monitors while green flight indicators slowly reappeared across the eastern corridor one by one. Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, Atlanta. The synchronized guidance system stabilized sector after sector until the final warning alarm finally disappeared into silence. Then the room exhaled all at once. Engineers collapsed into chairs. Government officials lowered trembling hands from their headsets. Somewhere near the back of the command floor, someone quietly started crying from relief. Colonel David Ross removed his headset slowly and looked toward Caleb Mercer with the kind of respect few men ever truly earn. Flight corridors stabilized, he announced calmly. All aircraft accounted for. Applause should have followed. Celebration should have erupted across the room. But it did not. Because everyone understood something deeper had happened there tonight. They had just watched a man save thousands of strangers without once raising his voice, demanding recognition, or reminding anyone who he was. Caleb stepped away from the central console quietly as though he had simply repaired another broken machine before the end of a workday. Naomi Sinclair watched him carefully from across the room, her chest tightening with emotion she no longer knew how to organize. Shame, gratitude, admiration, something softer too, something dangerous. Caleb removed the temporary security clearance badge clipped to his jacket and placed it gently on the command table. Daniel Reeves looked stunned. Commander, where are you going? Caleb glanced toward the digital clock above the command center. 9:37. My daughter has a school music performance at 10. Several people blinked in disbelief. Naomi stared at him. You are leaving? Caleb looked at her calmly. The system is stable now. But the Pentagon will survive one night without me. His tone carried no arrogance, only quiet certainty. Naomi stepped forward. Instinctively, at least let us restore your position. Caleb smiled faintly at that. You mean maintenance director? Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, embarrassed. Anything you want. Caleb looked around the glowing command floor one final time. The billion-dollar company, the federal officials, the executives who once dismissed him as invisible. I already have what I want, he said softly. The room fell silent again because everyone suddenly understood he meant it. Caleb turned toward the elevators. Halfway there he stopped briefly beside Harold Bennett, the older engineer sitting quietly near the back monitors. Caleb rested a hand on the man's shoulder. Take care of them, Harold. The older engineer nodded with wet eyes. You too, Commander. Naomi followed Caleb alone toward the executive elevator, while the command center slowly faded behind them. Neither spoke during the descent. Manhattan lights shimmered outside the glass walls like reflections floating across dark water. Finally, Naomi broke the silence. How do you carry all this responsibility without letting it change you? Caleb kept his eyes forward. Because one little girl still expects me home for bedtime. The elevator doors opened into the silent lobby. Outside, rain had stopped completely now. The city streets glowed beneath silver reflections and drifting fog while military personnel prepared the rooftop helicopter above for departure. Naomi walked beside Caleb through the lobby slowly, heels clicking softly against marble floors. Employees who had mocked him the day before now stood silently out of the way as he passed. Some lowered their heads. Others simply stared in quiet awe. Caleb acknowledged none of it. At the entrance doors, Naomi finally spoke again. I spent my whole life trying to become powerful. Caleb paused beneath the city lights outside. Naomi looked at him carefully, vulnerability softening her voice. Tonight I realized the strongest person in the room was the man who never needed anyone to know his name. Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then he looked toward the dark skyline above Manhattan where the helicopter blades already thundered softly overhead. Power fades, he said quietly. Character stays. Naomi felt those words settle somewhere deep inside her chest. The helicopter descended slowly onto the rooftop landing platform as wind swept across the tower. Officers moved into position immediately, but Caleb remained calm as always, hands in his jacket pockets while the city roared far below them. Before stepping toward the aircraft, he glanced once more at Naomi Sinclair standing beneath the rooftop lights with rain still glistening faintly in her hair. Take care of your people, he told her softly. They matter more than numbers on a screen. Then he boarded the helicopter. Naomi stood alone on the rooftop as the aircraft lifted into the night sky above Manhattan. No applause followed. No speeches. No cameras. Only silence. Deep and overwhelming. The kind of silence that happens when pride finally steps aside long enough to recognize grace. And far below the glowing towers of the city, a little girl waited in a school auditorium for her father to arrive before the music began. In one of the most emotional, touching stories of quiet dignity and redemption, a struggling single father is humiliated and fired by a powerful female chief executive officer, who has no idea he secretly built the defense system protecting millions of lives across America. As military helicopters descend and hidden truths emerge, the female chief executive officer begins to realize that real strength does not come from wealth or status, but from sacrifice, grace, and character. This unforgettable journey blends emotional drama, military mystery, and heartfelt family moments into one of the most inspiring, touching stories about second chances and respect. Fans of touching stories will experience powerful emotional twists, quiet heroism, and a deeply human love between a father and his daughter. With cinematic storytelling, emotional silence, and unforgettable reveals, this is one of those touching stories that stays in your heart long after the final scene. If you love touching stories filled with hope, dignity, and emotional justice, this story will move you deeply. Thank you for being here until the very end. Your support truly means a lot to this channel. Before you leave, tell us, are you watching as a husband, wife, mom, dad? Or just someone who enjoys stories like this? Share your answer in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe for more stories every week.